You recall yesterday we looked at the anatomy of a long bone, and we had much of this stuff on here, but I do just kind of want to run through it again to make sure we're all on the same page. This is a long bone. In this case, this would be the femur. For the most part, you know, we break bones down, long bones down into 3 parts. We name them based on the parts are named based on sort of the characteristics of those parts. For example, the epiphysis, the proximal epiphysis, is going to be the end of the bone that is nearer to the body. And it's going to be the end of the bone that is sort of from the epiphyseal plate, which is this structure kind of right here. It's from the epiphyseal plate upwards, okay, nearer to the body. And the distal epiphysis is from the epiphyseal plate distal. So these regions of the bone kind of they're kind of static, and then growth occurs in that middle range, in that diaphysis. Okay, so that diaphysis is that bone shaft. The ends of the bone are going to be covered. If the bone forms a joint with another bone, the end of the bone is going to be covered with articular cartilage, and that articular cartilage is going to be smooth. It might have some cushioning properties. For example, in the knee here, we would see the articular cartilage being, you know, really significantly cushioned with some fibrocartilage. But this is gonna you know, kind of be the general rule for all long bones. That articular cartilage is going to then be continuous with what we call the periosteum. And the periosteum is this tough sheet of connective tissue that wraps the entirety of the bone. And as I mentioned, that tough connective tissue sheet is going to afford a place for muscle attachment. It's going to be sort of continuous with tendon. It's going to be a place where blood vessels are attached to bone and things like that. So it provides that structural bit that allows those attachments. And it also makes the bone stronger. That periosteum is this tough, fibrous material that wraps the bone, and it does make it quite a bit stronger. The illustration here also shows some blood vessels. I think those were on there yesterday, but blood vessels entering the bone, blood vessels along the surface of the bone are going to be carrying oxygen and nourishment to the bone cells. The central cavity, or the space in here, I will add some notes to that. Oops. The central cavity is going to be, we call this the central canal. And it's going to be full of yellow marrow, right? And that's that fatty marrow we talked about. One of the things bones store is energy in fatty marrow. And generally speaking, yellow marrow is what we think of when we think of bone marrow. But when we talk about somebody getting a bone marrow transplant, we're actually talking about red marrow. Okay, and red marrow again is found in the epiphyses of these bones, and it is going to be involved in blood cell formation. So just taking a look at this bone, we see a few things, and I want to draw your attention to those things. We see this sort of bulging structure here and this bulge here. These are going to be places, and all bones are going to have stuff like this. So I'm just going to use this one sort of as the example bone. But we're going to see these bulges in places where ligaments are attaching, in places where tendons are attaching, in places where muscles are adhered to the bone. We see these surfaces that are going to be enhanced, I guess would be a word, to improve the attachment, and the bone will be thicker there. We call these things by various names. In this case, on the femur, we're talking about the greater and lesser trochanters, which are these bulging structures. These are the greater and lesser trochanters, but on other bones, we might call them tuberosities or tubercles or something to that effect. So these these structures actually end up getting named because they are significant as attachment points for other tissues. And I just thought I'd mention that because sometimes people are wondering, why do bones have the shape they have? And oftentimes it's because of, attachment of muscle or ligament or so on. But this is a long bone, okay? A lot of these characteristics are unique to long bones. A lot of the characteristics we see in this picture would be unique to long bones, but some of the stuff is pretty ubiquitous in going to be found in all bones. For example, the periosteum, we're going to find that wrapping all the bones. And the periosteum is going to be adhered to the bone via these tiny fibers. These tiny fibers are called Sharpie's fibers. And I am going to ask that you know that. These are gonna hold the periosteum to the bone. And I can't overstate the periosteum's role is somewhat important here. If you've ever had, I don't know, maybe you had or haven't, but if you've ever had a bone bruise, what they call a bone bruise, or a contusion of the bone, one of the things that can happen is that an injury to the bone can lead to bleeding between the bone and the periosteum, and it can lead to a really hard kind of a really hard deposit of it ultimately is blood, but it will sometimes calcify. It will actually cause a calcification and cause a calcium deposit. So you can end up with a lump on your shin or something if you have that, and that's because that periosteum from the impact got separated from the bone and the space filled with blood. So kind of an interesting kind of injury related thing. But anyway, this is a long bone, as I mentioned, and I have one right here. I have the bone we're looking at on the screen right in front of me. Okay, you can see it here. This is a femur. And I'm going to stop the share so I can show you this in greater detail. And I don't know if you're able to change the view. You can change your view to speaker view and get more of sort of a full screen effect of this. And this is a very old skeleton. This skeleton is from 1908. And we received it courtesy of a former teacher here who, my understanding is, he was able to obtain it when St. Vincent was getting a new skeleton. So this is a femur from a legit real human being. And you can see it's got some wear and tear. This thing's been bumped around a bit. Okay. This is, of course, the knee end of the femur. And when we're looking at this, where it's kind of damaged, actually it's going to work to our advantage. I don't know if you can see in there, but that is spongy bone. Okay, you can see how it is very much, almost looks like foamy, doesn't it? You can see there are these numerous pockets of empty space, and in life those would have been full of marrow, red marrow. We see the same thing. See the same thing at the proximal end. We see that marrow, or what would have been marrow containing spongy bone. So this is human femur, and I'm going to drop it on my computer. So how'd you break your computer screen? I dropped a bone on it. So anyway, that's a long bone, right? I also have here a human hand, okay, intact, complete. And here we see the bones of the hand, and you can see these are long bones, right? These are obviously long bones. Even these tiny little ones, the distal phalanges, these are long bones. They're longer than they are wide. Okay. But if I look at the bones of the wrist, and there are going to be 8 tiny bones here. I don't know if you can even see them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1. Let's count them again. So maybe I can count better. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 right there. Okay. So the way we remember these is a little mnemonic device. Straight line to pinky. Here comes the thumb. That's how we remember it. Scaphoid lunate. Straight line to triquetral pisiform. Hamate. Capitate. Trapezoid. Trapezium. Okay. So that's how we remember the straight line to pinky. Here comes the thumb. So it's just a little mnemonic device. You don't need to know them yet, but you will need to know them. So something to think about. But anyway, these are these bones, these 8 bones of the wrist, the carpals. These are what we call short bones. Okay, and they are kind of blocky looking, right? So just wanted to show you those because I thought it would be worthwhile to kind of illustrate the difference between the long bones of the hand and the short bones of the wrist. Okay, so that's about all I want to talk about, sort of the classification and shapes of bones, and that's about all I want to talk about with regard to a generalized long bone. But what I want to talk about now is, I got bone crumbs all over my stuff here. It's gross. Is the what we call the microanatomy of bone. Okay, so I'm going to first give you some terminology, and this terminology is going to be, sort of what we refer to when we talk about this stuff. And in general, the definition I give you, you should probably commit to memory or write it down or something to that effect. I think that would be a very useful thing. But if we look at a bone, and if we cut through a bone and looked at it kind of in some magnification, what we're going to see is, I'm just going to, well, one of the things we're going to see are called osteons. And the osteon is essentially the basic, subunit of bone. And the osteon is going to be kind of made of appears as concentric rings. It's going to appear as concentric rings of bony tissue. Sometimes we will hear this called the Haversian system. Okay, and if I were to cut through a bone, if I had a bone, again, I'll do a real quick hasty drawing of a femur. This is your leg. I feel bad for you. If I cut through here and I saw this portion of the bone, and then I zoomed in, if I zoomed way in on this, okay, just zoom right in on that part, I might see the osteon appears as concentric rings of bony tissue. And at the center of all of that, I would find an open space. find an open space right at the center here. I'm highlighting it red. The reason why I'm highlighting in red is actually because it's going to have, that's going to be the place where we see a blood vessel passing through. So I'll make a note of that. And we call that space the Haversian canal. And these are passageways that are going to follow the long axis of the bone. So what we're seeing here, we're actually seeing a passageway that follows the long axis of the bone. So, if I take my best art skills and draw this kind of in 3D, then I would actually see that these osteons were sort of columnar. They're actually sort of columnar within the bone. Okay, they're actually kind of columnar within the bone. And I didn't mean for that color to change there, so I'll change that back to red. And this is sort of the function of how bone's going to be growing. It's going to grow in these and be ossified in these concentric rings. If I zoomed way in, on these rings, the rings of this, what I would see would be that there are actually little pockets, little spaces that kind of surround the ring. If I looked, and I'm just going to try to draw them here a little bit bigger than they probably actually appear to kind of show you this. And I'll be, in our next lesson, kind of showing you some micrographs of this, some actual pictures to kind of illustrate this. But we see these little pockets, okay? See these little pockets. And these little pockets are going to be the place where we're going to find actual bone cells residing. This is where we actually see the bone cells in the bone, okay? So these little pockets, and I don't know if you recall, when we talked about cartilage, we talked about the little pockets where the cartilage cells resided. It's actually got the same name. We call these little pockets lacunae. These are the pockets where the bone cells are found. So in looking at this, that's kind of what we're talking about here. We're talking about these little pockets. And in those pockets, that's, like I said, that's where we find the bone cells. These are called osteocytes. They're going to be found in there. So the bone cells are called osteocytes. I don't know why it's changing the color like that. That's peculiar. So osteocytes are bone cells. And we have a couple of different types of cells that we associate with bones. We have what are called osteoblasts. And we have what are called osteoclasts. Osteoblasts are cells that are going to build bone. The way I always taught this and the way I always remembered it was blasts build bone. Okay. Osteoclasts are going to break down bone. Suffix clast means to break down. Okay. So osteoblasts build bone, osteoclasts break bone down. And these two cell types have very different functions within the bone. Osteoblasts are going to respond to stimulus to increase bone mass and bone density. Osteoblasts are going to be active when you're growing. And osteoclasts are going to be called in when we need to extract some calcium. We need to get some calcium out of the calcium reservoir. Osteoclasts are going to be who jumps in and starts to break break that bone down. And we see osteoblast and osteoclast activity kind of in balance throughout life. But once we start to hit a certain age, we see osteoblast activity sort of dropping, and we see osteoclast activity kind of remaining the same. And ultimately what that leads to is loss of bone density with age. So these two bone cell types definitely are in balance. Probably, I'm 40. Probably right now I'm pretty well in balance in terms of bone cell activity, and I'm in good health, you know. But if we looked at, you know, the activity of these cells, you know, for me in 20 years, when I'm going to be 60 in 20 years. Oh my gosh, maybe I'll have a midlife crisis then. Maybe I'll live to be 120 and 60 will actually be midlife for me. I don't know. That'd be cool. But anyway, these bone cells are going to reside in these lacunae. The rings themselves are called lamellae. So the rings themselves are called lamellae. And I should mention, you know, all these words sound the same. So it's probably going to benefit you to make yourself some nice flashcards or study this a little bit to kind of help you learn them. Like lacunae are the pockets, lamellae are the rings that the pockets are in, okay? And if we look at this, and I'm going to kind of do a zoomed in drawing of this, if I looked at this, what I would see would be the rings, kind of, there's space in these rings, and then there are these little spaces, kind of, that's the lacunae. And these lacunae between osteon, or between lamellae and the osteon, are going to afford the cells space to kind of be. Okay, so this is, you know, sort of a pie slice through right here. So that's kind of what I've drawn, is a pie slice through. What we're going to see are bone cells then that are fitting into these spaces here. They're going to fit kind of in these spaces. And it should be noted, and everything's on my screen is going bonkers. It should be noted that the pocket is more than just a simple pocket. The pocket is going to have these little branching spaces, that come out called canaliculi, which literally means tiny canals. Tiny canals, okay? And the tiny canals are going to be places where bone cells, their appendages of bone cells are going to kind of spread out into them. So bone cell appendages. These are essentially little pockets, you know, little branches off the main pocket of the lacuna that the bone cell kind of has these appendages that reach out into. So yeah, pretty wild stuff. And this is a term you should be familiar with. Okay, so these are all terms that you should be familiar with. Lacunae, lamellae, canaliculi, osteoblast, osteoclast, haversian canal, and osteon are terms that definitely are worth knowing. Now, if I looked at this bone and I cut, we'll call it a frontal section of this bone, okay? So I had the bone and it was here, and it looked like, you know, the same, right? But it's actually cut in half. I could see the entirety of the medullary cavity and so on. If I zoomed in on the compact bone, what I would see, to be sure, I would see those vertical haversian canals, and I'll use red for the blood vessel, I would see those vertical haversian canals running kind of in the long axis of the bone. But then I would see some branching canals that went sort of across the bone. I'm so thankful that this thing is changing all the colors for me. It's really helpful. I would see these branching canals that went across the bone. And these are going to allow blood vessels to enter into the inside of the bone, into that medullary cavity. Okay. So what I'm going to do, I'm trying to think of the best way to do this. I have a nice picture here I'm going to share with you. I guess maybe I'll just email it to myself. And I'll post it in the post it on the next slide. All right, so give me 2 seconds here, and I will post that on the next slide. Just waiting for the picture to come through. And the email's not coming. Oh, there it is. Okay. So let's try this now. So this is kind of a nice little picture. And I think you could probably see it now. Of course, now it's on the wrong slide. Love it when this cooperates. There we go. Not sure why it did that. So if we look at this diagram, this is basically what I was creating, but no sense reinventing the wheel. What we're going to see here are a few of those structures I was talking about. We're going to see the pockets of tissue that are the pockets in the bony tissue that are representative of the lacunae. Right here we see a pocket. We can see it from the top view here. And we see these small canals that branch out from the canals of the osteons, right? So you can all see that. But then if we kind of pan back and reduce our zoom, we'll look at the central canal. We see the central canal is going to have a blood vessel running through it, right? We see this blood vessel here, and it comes all the way in from the outside. We have blood circulation that enters all the way in and into that medullary cavity. Now, I mentioned the Haversian canal. Okay, the Haversian canal is going to be central to the osteon. Here we have one here, kind of, we would see a blood vessel in it. But if we look at these ones that are running transverse, so the vertical canals are going to be the Haversian canals. The ones that run across the bone are called Volkmann's canals or perforating canals. These terms are interchangeable. So they're either perforating or Volkmann's canals. And they're going to allow blood to enter from the outside. Okay? They're going to allow blood to enter from the outside. And this is what brings nutrition and oxygen into those cells of the bone. Okay? So anyway, this diagram, real nice diagram. And like I said, I'll be sharing this with you, this whole slideshow with you. So just be patient for that, because we're going to basically build the slideshow. When it's all done, I'll give it to you. And I'll be giving you the videos kind of in the interim. But if we look at this kind of in some detail, what we're seeing is, yeah, sure, we have these concentric osteons, but then kind of wrapping the entirety of the bone, we're going to see these great big concentric, we'll call them growth rings, but that's not really what they are. We're going to see these great big kind of encircling osteons that encompass all of the bone. Okay, so this is pretty typical of in particular long bone, but compact bone in a long bone. So remember, we have that compact bone on the outside portion of the long bone. It's going to be structural and very strong. Okay. So do you have any questions? Do you have any questions about any of the stuff we've talked about thus far with regard? Okay, so the last little bit here we're going to look at is going to be relating to growth plates and growth plate development, and talk about sort of how the region of elongation of the bone is going to be the growth plate. So this is a cartilaginous layer that's at the epiphyseal plate, and deposition of new bone is going to occur here. This is where the bone is going to elongate, allowing for growth. The term I just used is ossification. Ossification means deposition of bony tissue, and it means to become bony. So ossification at the growth plate is going to lead to growth. And in fact, eventually that growth plate itself will ossify and become bone. And once the growth plate has totally ossified and become bone, that pretty much means you're done growing. At least height-wise, you're done growing. So yeah, this is all kind of tied together. The structure of bone and the anatomy of bone, all kind of connected. So anyway, thanks a lot.